My name's Leslie and I am going to be the MC for today. I would just like to do the acknowledgement of country to start today. So we acknowledge the Pakana and Palawa people of Lutruwita, the traditional owners of the land upon which we live and work. We pay respects to elders past and present as the knowledge holders and sharers. We honour their strong culture and knowledges as vital to the self-determination, well-being and resilience of their communities. We stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history. So to get things started, it is now my pleasure to welcome Minister Felix Ellis, who's the Minister for Skills and Training, who's going to say a few words today on behalf of the state government.
G'day everybody, thanks for having me here today. Has anyone heard the old saying, become a dairy farmer to have an easy life? No? Me neither. Obviously it's hard work, you know, being a dairy farmer. You get up early, long days, you're working with big animals and even bigger machinery, so there's risks involved and all that sort of stuff. But it's an incredible way of life, and you get to work with beautiful animals. And for young people in particular that are starting out and really looking to get ahead, being a dairy farmer is a great way to build capital and maybe one day realise the opportunity to own your own piece of ground. And have that. I see a hand raised there, but maybe that was just saying g'day to someone else. But that's one of the reasons why we need to be investing in dairy research, because you guys work bloody hard and you're doing incredible things here in Tasmania. We punch massively above our weight for milk production per head of population. And so every little bit of research that we can do to make your life easier on the farm, working with these animals, is a huge investment in the productivity and the future of our state. Dairy is a huge economic driver for us, as you guys know. It's our largest land-based agricultural output, nearly $500 million. And we need dairy to grow even more so that we can reach that target of $10 billion farm gate by 2050. So to do that, it takes us working together. It can't be just relying on the incredible natural assets that we have of rich soil, temperate climate, plentiful rainfall and water. It's about making sure that we're getting the most out of you incredible hard-working people so that you can continue the love of what you do, but also make sure that you're at the cutting edge. Here in Tasmania, we obviously compete against the rest of the world when it comes to our dairy products. We're a big exporter and we're never going to have enough Tasmanians to eat all the dairy products that you guys are churning out. So that means that staying at the cutting edge is vital. As a government, we're always keen to be investing. Over the last 5 years, we put in about $8 million into additional agricultural research. Tea has been a big recipient of that because tea is really at the cutting edge too. And one of the things that we really love as a government about investing in agricultural research is that it gets repaid and matched by industry, because industry recognises, just as government does, that we need to continue to grow your capability and do what you do at the cutting edge, becoming ever more productive as the seasons go by. I know that we've got a really exciting agenda ahead of us today, and from the conversations that I've had, there seems to be a lot of interest, particularly in the research around virtual fencing, ways to more efficiently use nitrogen on farm, as well as feed supplements that can help us to reduce agricultural emissions in the dairy industry, which will hopefully future-proof this industry for many, many years to come. So I think it's going to be a really exciting day. There's clearly a lot of interest here. Minister Elliott sends her apologies for today. She would have loved to have been here. She's from the southeast, so I know she was looking forward to seeing how the real farmers really do things. But I'm sure that you know how much she as a minister supports this sector and the agricultural industry as a whole. So I hope you all have a great day. I hope you learn a lot. I hope you keep doing the incredible work that you guys are doing to keep dairy farming in Tasmania at the cutting edge, leading the nation and leading the world. And before I finish up, can I just also please give a big shout out to any of the first responders who are here in the room today. We've got big bushfires happening down the west coast, and I know that farmers are really the heart and soul of a lot of rural brigades. So thank you for your service and for your sacrifice, and to everyone who's come along today. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Minister Ellis. It is now my pleasure to welcome Professor Mike Rose, who's the Director of TIA, to do the official welcome for today.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to see so many people here. A very warm welcome to the TIA Dairy Research Facility here at Elliott, and the demonstration of us all here being such a vibrant dairy industry that we have here in Tasmania, an industry that's growing, that there's a lot of optimism around, and I'm pretty sure that we'll see further growth going forward. I would like to thank Minister Ellis for giving the opening speech. Thank you very much indeed, and also to thank John Penry from Dairy Australia, who will be following me to say a few more words. Thank you both, and also to Senator Anna Urquhart, who was here a little bit earlier as well. Tasmania has got a lot of advantages for dairying. We've got our temperate climate. We've got secure access to water, we've got fertile soils, we've got an industry that has demonstrated that it is agile to taking on new opportunities, and I've got lots of examples in mind of that, and there's one in particular that we'll be talking about later today. We've got an industry that is well trained, that is knowledgeable. We've got relative isolation from many of the diseases as well, and as somebody who lived through the foot and mouth outbreak in the United Kingdom in 2001, believe me, we do not want to see that here in Tasmania, 100%. And also, another advantage is that we have great policy support as well, from all levels of government, both particularly in the Tasmanian state, but also from Canberra as well. They are massive advantages for the dairy industry here in Tasmania, and it's our job to take advantage of them. Of course, we're not without challenges as well. We have climate change. Climate change is already with us. We were already seeing increased, this last year was the hottest ever across the globe. We're seeing bushfires in Tasmania where we've never seen bushfires before. We're likely to see more droughts, more floods, and more extreme weather events, along with the general warming. And there's more of that to come as well. We need to get on the front foot with regard to that so that we are prepared, because climate change also brings opportunity as well, so long as we can be agile to those opportunities and pivot to what's needed. We also are likely to have more restrictions in terms of the resources that we have, particularly nitrogen fertiliser, for example, is only ever going to get more expensive. And then labour is another challenge that I know faces a lot of farms. Field days such as this are our opportunity to come together, to share knowledge, to discover new things, and to take advantage of those advantages and to get on the front foot in terms of the challenges. And that is absolutely what we are here to do today. That is absolutely what we should be doing today. So TIA is extremely proud to host today's event. TIA is about, well, firstly doing the research, and that is really important. But if the research gets published in a journal and then that gets shoved on a shelf and then gathers dust for all eternity, it may as well never been done. It's also really important that that research is digested in a way that can be accepted by industry and communicated to industry, and really to generate that impact so that you don't just get farmer practice change, but farmer practice change that delivers the outcomes that we're looking for, which include environmental outcomes, which include increased profitability, which include a bigger agricultural sector for the Tasmanian state. Not only does TIA do research, but we also do courses as well. We deliver our agricultural science offering, not only in Hobart now, but also in Launceston. And that's an opportunity for everyone to study closer to home, and because, of course, that's really important, particularly for folk from the agricultural community. Did you know that the TIA Agricultural Science course was the best agriculture course in Australia in 2024. Not amongst the best in Australia, but the best in Australia. And that was because of the course content, the way that it was delivered, the dedication of the staff, and the resources that were available to our students as well. For 2025, we're in the top 3 out of 30 odd, but then of course we've got to give others a chance now and then to take their part. Elliott is central to our delivery of the mandate that TIA has to do research and industry development and extension and that engagement with farmers. Elliott is the place to do risky research, stuff that you couldn't do on a commercial farm because it might not work. And there's plenty of examples of that today, of stuff that occasionally doesn't work and stuff that does work as well. It's our place for exploring the future of dairying. So today we've got a great lineup. We've got Megan Verdon, who's going to talk about virtual fencing. We've got Simon Jones, who's going to be talking about benchmarking, because if you don't know where your business is, you don't know where your business is relative to other businesses, then you really are at risk of falling behind. We've got Richard Rawnsley talking about abating livestock emissions, because for the dairy industry in Tasmania, that's absolutely key to our future. Dairying in Tasmania produces far more milk than we could ever drink or consume within Tasmania, and so therefore dairying is dependent on exports, and our export markets will depend on our cows not emitting methane. Put bluntly, is that the possums? And so therefore that abating methane emissions from dairy cows or greenhouse gas emissions from dairy cows is absolutely key to our industry's future. We also have a farm update I beg your pardon. We've also got Hannah Sadler, who is from who will speak about natural capital accounting, and she's from the Cradle Coast NRM, and we welcome her. After that, we've got a series of farm walks, one looking at clover and nitrogen fixation, another looking at managing multi-species in pastures, another looking at the soil and soil health and the microbiome within soil, and then another on a farm update, and then opportunity to have a look at the virtual fencing, and also to have a look at the biodiversity on the farm as well. So they'll kind of run in rotation, and everybody will have an opportunity to do everything. A lot of those farm walks will be looking at what we call our farmlet study, which is basically we've separated this farm or parts of this farm into 4 individual farmlets, which have got different nitrogen treatments. We've got a standard treatment of 300 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and then 2 other treatments, and then a 4th farmlet that is not using any nitrogen at all. And that is potentially transformational in the way that it still allows cow performance, and certainly there'll be a lot to be said about that later on. That farmlet study is done in association with Dairy Australia, and I'll be welcoming John Penry to speak to us again in a second from Dairy Australia. TIA has a very strong relationship with Dairy Australia, and I'm very happy to announce that our funding relationship that we have with Dairy Australia will be extended for another year, from this September to the September following, while we finish the farmlet study and then consider what the other emerging challenges are for Tasmanian agriculture, and I hope sincerely that our relationship with Dairy Australia continues well into the future and well beyond next September, or September of next year as well. So, today is your day to engage, and I hope that you participate, and I hope that you explore. This is our opportunity to learn from each other and to strengthen our bonds, and for us all to learn more about the dairy industry in Tasmania. I would like to thank the TIA staff who've enabled today to put today on, the livestock production staff, the TIA event staff, the Tas Farm Innovation Hub as well. I'd like to thank the NRM for helping to support us as well, and a whole host of other people as well. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Today is a day of learning, for collaboration, and for inspiration. And I hope you'll enjoy today as I certainly will. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the field day. Dairy Australia is very proud of the investment that is done in this facility through TIA. We're very proud of the investment with your levy funds. This investment has been over multiple years now, not only in the current project, which is called Dairy High 2, and the associated soils project that is bolted onto the side of it, but also in the previous work that was done through other iterations of Dairy High. Part of the reason why we're proud of it is not just because of the facility here, but because of the excellent team at TIA who not only oversees the research and guides the research, but takes great pastoral care, if I can put it that way, of how things unfold on this facility, because doing this type of research is a complex beast and it takes great attention to detail, and that's what they have here. I'm old enough to remember, I've been in the dairy industry for 34 years now, and I'm old enough to remember that state-based farms dedicated to dairy research were dotted around the country. These are state-based assets. Now there's 3 of them, one in Tassie, one in Queensland, one in Victoria. All of the other research assets that were farm-based, dedicated to dairy, have essentially withered on the vine or been sold. So people who live in this state should be enormously proud of the fact that the state government, together with TIA, have invested in this site. I have been here lots of times over 34 years, and what we've got now on this site is one of the best research farms, certainly in the country. It's one of the best research farms in the world, to be honest. And one of the reasons why the research coming out of here is going to be so useful to us into the future is because doing farmlet-based work is complex, it's expensive, and it's difficult. But the great thing about farmlet-based research is you can draw great inference. You can draw great conclusions that can then be used on commercial dairy farms. And that's what we're sitting on here. Over the 3 lactations that are going to be finished in the Dairy High 2 project, along with the soils project, which is onto the side of it, along with the other components which we're going to hear about today, the likes of which from Megan Verdon, we're going to have the ability to have enormously powerful results to apply for other parts of the country, including here, because as we all know, dairy farming is a complex production system. It's applied science, it's applied knowledge, and this is part of the knowledge base into the future. So we're very proud of it, and thank you for coming. You're going to have a good day. Thank you very much.
So there's not really much left for me to say. So we're just going to get into it. Yep. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Megan Verdon, who is going to be sharing it with us today, some of the research that has been taking place here in the space of virtual fencing.
Thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk about virtual fencing with you today. I feel like I've been talking about virtual fencing at these open days for a few years now. So I am, for those who have sat in these before, just a heads up, I'm going to go over some content that we may have heard from before for the benefit of those that may not have been here before. But trust me, there's a whole heap of new stuff. We've had a really big year. So there'll be a nice mix, just hang in there. What is virtual fencing? It's a new technology that enables us to control and manage cattle at pasture using sensory cues rather than an electric fence or someone chasing them on a bike. So how it works is that each cattle in your mob is given a collar, and you can tell that collar where a fence line is on your phone through GPS. So on your phone you program a fence location. That location, the GPS location, gets communicated to a base station. It goes out towards all these other base stations on your farm. They tell the collar where that location is. Now, when the cow then approaches that fence line, the collar will give her a warning cue. So normally this is an audio cue. And then if she continues and crosses over that line, it gives her a second cue. So normally it's an electrical stimulus, a pulse or a shock. Over time, what happens is the animal learns that that audio cue means hey, you better stop walking or you're going to get that negative stimulus. And she learns to start responding to the audio cue alone. We see this learning occurs really quickly, and we are increasingly able to manage the animals using the audio cue by itself. So you can see in this video, it's from Cyro, it's an old tech, that yellow dotted line. I think you can kind of see it on that screen, that's where the GPS virtual fence is. So we ran a really big trial here back in 2023 now with the Halter technology. And what we did in this trial, it went for about 6 weeks. We were really focused on understanding how the technology works, how the animals respond to it, and also in quantifying some of the welfare measures around the tech. The first thing that we found was around virtual fencing. So this is when they're in a paddock, they're kept behind a virtual fence line. And we found that it was effective in keeping the animals in their pasture. I would think it was something like 99.85% of the time. So it was 0.15% of their time in the paddock, they might cross that fence line. When they did cross that fence line, they moved less than a metre. So it was really, maybe taking a step over, getting their cue and turning around. And you can see some of the grazing lines that we have there. Now, just out of interest, for this study, I also chucked up a whole heap of cameras to record how animals interacted with normal electric fencing. And this is because when we're talking about virtual fencing, people get very fixated on how many times they're interacting with that front fence, but we don't really have a comparison anywhere on how many times they actually interact with an electric fence. And surprisingly, what we found out of the 25 hours of videos is they're touching that fence a hell of a lot more than what you think. So we recorded 335 interactions. Nearly half from it. I don't know what I meant by that second point when I wrote this. It equaled about one interactions per cow per day. And this was over a 4 to 6 hour period that we had those cameras at. By comparison, when we look at the virtual fence, there are around 3 to 8 interactions per day with the virtual fence. Now, with the electric fence, every time they touch it, it doesn't necessarily result in a shock. And that's because we get shortages with fences. It depends on where the pulse is going through it, depends on the contact with the animal. About 6% of times, in these videos that they touched the electric fence, did we see a response that made us go, okay, she definitely got something. Around half of those interactions was receiving a shock on their neck, their head, their nose, their ear. And this is because they're grazing underneath that fence. That's where they're getting the interactions. And around 35% on their tail. Now that 6% of interactions resulting in a shock, I compare that to the virtual fencing, which was around, a median cow got 0 shocks in a week, or 0.14. So they're not getting that many actual shocks for their interactions with the virtual fencing system. The other thing that the Halter tech that does, who we work with for this technology, is virtual herding. So there are a number of virtual fencing technologies available. Halter's the only one that does this herding function. The rest all do virtual fencing as well. Now, Halter is able to use virtual herding by introducing another stimulus. It's a vibration. What happens with this is the vibration first, it will alert animals that something's about to change in their environment. So it's like, time to wake up, get up, girl, something's about to happen. The other thing it does is keep them moving. So how it works is that the audio will tell an animal which way to turn, to avoid getting a shock. The vibration, what it does is keep her moving forward. If she stops walking, the collar starts to vibrate, and the intensity of that vibration increases over about a 45-second period. And then if she's still not moving after that, that's when it will deliver a pulse. They learn very quickly to respond to this vibration cue, and we see very few pulses in the virtual herding function. Part of that is because these are dairy animals and they know where they're going. They move to the dairy twice a day anyway. Now, I've got a video here that just demonstrates cows moving to the dairy with the virtual herding tech. I'm going to see if this works. What I like about this video is that this is on their day 4 of training. And I just like people to try and identify the moment where the cows get the cue to move. So it shows how peaceful it is, how calm it is. They know where they're going. They know what the technology is asking them to do. And keep in mind, again, this is on their 4th day of training, so they've picked it up quite quickly, even though it's a relatively complex thing to learn. Now, as part of that work, we were really interested in understanding how the animals were coping with the technology. And animal welfare is an increasingly important part of sustainability. We need to be able to demonstrate when we're changing something about how we manage animals, that those animals are meeting at least the same standards, if not improved standards, to what they're currently being managed in. As part of this study, we took a whole heap of milk samples for these animals. What happens when we become stressed? We release a hormone into our blood. It's called cortisol. Cortisol crosses over into the milk. So that's very convenient for us. We can collect milk and we analyse that for measures of cortisol. Now, this is a pretty scientific looking chart, but pretty much up the top there, you've got green and blue colour, red and blue. So the red, that's an electric fence group. The blue is a virtual fence group. Down the bottom, the green is electric fence and the purple is a virtual fence. And what this chart is saying is that in both our replicates and comparisons, there's no difference in the stress levels between groups. There may be odd days where one's higher than the other, but it's not consistent, it's random, and it's pretty much suggesting that the animals are performing just as well. So from that work, we approached this and thought, well, I think we get a really good understanding of how the animals are learning, what's happening with them and how they're doing in these systems. And we're keen to start working directly with farmers to kind of quantify the sort of impacts that they're actually getting on farm. So this work that I'm going to go through is just some preliminary results of trials that we've been running over the last 12 months. The work is funded by the Tassie government through the Ag Development Fund. And what we've done with that is we've got a group of farmers, they're halter farmers, and they're advising us. So they're telling us what sort of things that they think are priorities for us to look at with the technology. One of the first things we looked at was around optimising post-calving care. So cows, when they finish calving and they go into the colostrum mob, there's a lot of things going on for them, like physiologically and emotionally. And some of them adapt better than others. What halter can do, because it has behaviour monitoring abilities, is identify animals that perhaps aren't doing quite as well as some others, and it can send an alert to farmers. What the farmers that we were talking to wanted to know is what is actually going on with these animals. They thought that this would help them then provide a more tailored care, and obviously the post-calving period is very intense and busy, so anything that could help them provide high quality care to the animals would be a benefit. Now, with this study, we went out, we worked with 5 farms. They were all halter farms. We took blood samples from cows that were flagged by the technology as potentially not doing so well, and we took blood samples from a similar number of cows at a similar days post-calving, similar parity, all of that sort of thing. So there's a whole bunch of physiological measures in there. There's markers of inflammation, of metabolic disease, and of immune status. And what we found is there wasn't a hell of a lot different between the animals that we were identified as not recovering well and those that were doing fine, which was an interesting thing for us. But what we did see is that on 4 of these farms, they went from a really high fibre diet to, like the rocket fuel high pasture diet quite quickly, and we get a whole heap of alerts on those farms. There was another farm that had a more slow transition diet period, and we didn't get many alerts on that farm at all. So what we think is that just some of the adjustment to this new nutritional environment post-calving is resulting in differences in how the animals behave and how they feel. And it's hard to differentiate between animals that are just adjusting to that and animals that have a serious metabolic thing that needs attention. So I think, we want to keep working on this, but it highlighted to us the importance of that management during transition. We're also really interested in how the technology can be used in perhaps new and novel ways to optimise the grazing system. So last year we ran a trial on perhaps a new novel way that the technology could be used to feed our animals. This was based on the idea that at the moment, with electric fencing, that we're feeding cows at times that suit us. So when you're out at the dairy, you're already there, you can go and drop a fence and feed them. In the past, we've run studies where we've thought the technology could potentially be used to feed cows more frequently and that this would stimulate grazing and increase intake. But we actually saw that in that system, when you're constantly stimulating grazing, they will feed at the expense of rumination, and that by upsetting that normal balance, we actually reduced milk production in those animals. So we didn't want to go there again. Instead, we thought, what if we fed them when cows want to eat? Now, cows do have natural behavioural fluctuations. They like to graze in the evening the most. That's when they want their biggest meal. They'll have a little top-up overnight. They'll eat again at dawn, but really during the day, they'll just snack in. So we tried to use the technology to design a grazing system that mimics this. We gave them 65% of their allocation at night. And we gave them a little bit just before they came into the dairy. The reason we did this is that we were thinking that with that, by bringing them into the dairy on an empty rumen, we may be increasing the risk of acidosis in these animals. The rest of their pasture allocation we gave in the middle of the day. Now for these cows, we also got these Max Tech boluses in a proportion of the animals. What the boluses do is continuously record the pH of the rumen. And this is what it looked like. So we've got the pink and the blue. They're our virtual fence animals with the optimised grazing. The red and the green, virtual fence animals, but they're just on the normal twice-a-day feeding regime. So we reduced the time spent in subclinical acidosis and in acidosis with our grazing regimes. Now, we're still going through a heap of the other data with the milk production and behaviour, so we're not 100% sure where that sits, but preliminary, I think this is the biggest finding that we're getting from that study. Now, we're also working with farmers to kind of try and quantify some of the benefits they are getting on farm, and this is an ongoing piece of research still funded by the Ag Development Fund. I don't have data for you on this, but I am going to present a couple of case studies of things that farmers have told me that they're doing on their farm with this technology. So the first is a farmer that's using heat maps, which is generated with the technology, to see how cattle are using the paddock, and he's actually using the technology to maybe move animals to areas for longer periods of time where they don't spend a lot of time, and then they're dumping more nitrogen in that area themselves. He's also moving them off areas where they're dumping a lot of nitrogen. So he's using the tech, in addition with the heat maps, to try and get a more even distribution of a natural fertilisation through the animals. Now, virtual fencing is able to manage cows on winter forage crops. One of the issues with winter grazing, which I'm sure most of you would know, is it can get really muddy, and that's not great for cows. They don't like to lie in wet mud. Now, we have one farmer who will put them on the winter forage crop for a couple of hours. Once that's done, he actually uses the technology to move them out of that paddock into a fresh paddock on pasture where they'll stay overnight and they can rest. This also reduces damage to the paddock and improves soil quality. I like this one because it kind of feeds back into the study that we found with the transition cows. So this farmer has created an additional mob, which I know fills people with terror when you think about another mob to manage at calving, but it's not so difficult with halter. And this is just from our farm, and it shows that we manage 5 mobs as a day-to-day thing here. So this additional mob is in between the colostrums and the milkers. They stay there for about 3 weeks, and it just allows a particular targeted nutritional regime and management of these animals in there. This one's from a farmer in New Zealand who had no power after Cyclone Gabrielle and had these big openings in the volcanic soil around his farm as a result of that cyclone. He lost a lot of fencing. He had no power in his remaining electric fencing. With the Halter Tech, he got Starlink in. It was powered by battery. He was still able to manage those animals, which includes keeping them away from these areas that were opening up in his paddocks. He now uses it in a similar way to move cows into shade on hot days or off mud as well. And finally, I like this one because this is a farmer who said that he went on holidays with his family for the first time in 20 years. He said he hasn't taken more than 3 days off the farm, and he had 3 holidays then planned for that 1 year. He felt confident because he could keep an eye on the cow movements, he could make sure the staff were assigning cows to the right paddocks, he could look at their health and all of these things. So it just goes to show for me that there are these benefits to the technology that we may not be able to quantify quite easily, but they're the really important things for us to talk about as well. Okay, thank you.
So our next presentation is going to be about greenhouse gas emissions, and Associate Professor Richard Rawnsley is going to be talking about the work that's happening in this space. And so really looking forward to hearing about it.
Thank you. In 1896, physical chemist, Nobel Prize winning physical chemist Svante Arrhenius said, improved, that if the global emissions of CO2 went up, then the globe would warm. At the time, what Svante was working on was explaining why the globe held a constant temperature of around 14.5 degrees. Without greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the world would be about -18, probably a little bit colder than we'd like. And what he was describing at the time was the ability of the greenhouse gases to actually capture and trap heat into the earth and make it the world we are able to live in. When he was proposing this, and being Swedish, a bit not dissimilar to myself, when I first started working in climate change, I think it might be quite nice to be a little bit warmer. Most of his colleagues said this was not possible. Reason being that we've got sinks to capture any increases in global carbon emissions or CO2 emissions. Those sinks are our oceans and our forests. At the time, we think about this, we're talking 130 years ago, so not too many of us in this room would remember. But the globe, the population, maybe a couple. Barry, you're here. It's great to see Barry Rowe here, by the way. Barry Rowe, former Senate Leader of Dairy. Where are you, Barry? You're here somewhere. Put your hand up. Great to see you here. So Svante was talking, his colleagues said, the world will not produce enough emissions to cope with that. The population was less than 2 billion people, and our energy use was around about 6 exajoules. Now, you're wondering what an exajoule is? It's 1 with 18 zeros, bit like Pieter Raedts' bank account, I reckon. So that's a lot of energy. To put it into context, it's about 24 million tonnes of coal at the time. The globe today is closer to, as we know, approaching as a population about 8 billion people, and we now fossil fuel use is over 500 exajoules. To give you some context, 24 million tonnes of coal, 274 million barrels of oil. So what's happened? We've exceeded our sinks. Our sources have exceeded our sinks, and I think we failed to tell this story enough. We produced close to 35, what we call gigatons of CO2 equivalents, and that's what we're measuring, that's what we see there. Esther Price told me never to turn around and point at a screen. I always do and fail at training. What we've got there is 35 gigatons being produced from our fossil fuel use. We've got land use change, which is mostly associated with deforestation. And our ability to capture those sinks through our oceans and our forests are not enough. And so this isn't new, this is just science, this is physics, this is chemistry. And so the atmosphere's got, in a sense, become the sink for those additional emissions. And not surprisingly, what we've seen is CO2 go up in the atmosphere. And so when Svante was talking about that would result in warming, most of them thought it wasn't probably possible to see a world where we were so dependent on fossil fuel use and exceeding those sinks. Not surprisingly, this is over the last 50 years, our CO2 emissions have risen from 330 parts per million to now 421. I'm not sure it's a causation, but my weight gain per year looks very similar to this graph, so I'm trying to change that. When I started out in this work, it was 380 parts per million, it's gone up 40 and it's sort of the same. So anyway, we'll see if we got to reverse it, hey. One of the impacts of that, just like weight gain, is we have consequences, and that is that we've seen a fair bit of warming, and Mike, you mentioned it in your opening address. We've lived through 1 degree of warming. We're very much on a path where 1.5 is locked in. To give you that context, you've seen the CO2. We produce about 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalents as a globe. We have a global budget at the moment that says if we exceed around 1,350 over the next 20 odd years, then we're locked into 2 degrees. We've only got about 400 to go from actually living through 1.5, and it looks like we're very much on that. And some are saying that 2 degrees is a given. Now, what we don't probably know is enough is what does that actually mean for what the impacts are, but we've obviously gone through that. We are seeing a lot more extreme events. We're seeing longer periods without rain, and then we get rain and it's a lot more intense. And we look across the globe and most people are suffering in some regards to the way that the climate has changed, and I think it's unequivocal when we look at that and understand science. So what do we need to do, and what's the responsibility, us who particularly work in a profession that really I think we should be very proud of? You know, we've got to feed 8 billion people. The world won't survive without food for 3 or 4 days. So that's not going to change. And what contribution does our agri-food sectors make to this global budget? So CO2 itself are the main drivers. You can see there in the bar chart, we've got direct emissions associated with fossil fuel use and the like. Put that number up before, that represents 65% of the 50 gigatons. Land use change, another 11%, and then we look at what methane contributes. It's about 16%. So that put that into context, it's about 8 gigatons of CO2 equivalents come from methane alone. Agriculture itself makes up directly about 12%, land use another 4%, so agriculture's contribution is about 16%. When we look at the indirect emissions associated with logistics and transport and infrastructure and builds, the agri-food sector itself is nearly 1/3 of our global emissions. So we have a responsibility as a sector to find ways to reduce that while continuing to provide nutritional food to feed the globe. So us as, I suppose, those that work in the livestock sector and particularly farm ruminants go, what is our contribution to that? It's about 30 to 40% of the methane. So in total, we're about 2.5 gigatons, or 5% comes from domesticated ruminants. The other methane sources come from fossil fuels, rice cultivation, land and waste. So that's the picture. And not surprisingly, again, you can go an hour or so up the road to the northwest and Cape Grin, and we can see that the other greenhouse gases that we monitor, methane and nitrous oxide, are increasing. Everything's measured against CO2 to give us an accounting. It's based over a 100-year time frame. A couple of take-homes out of this. Methane has a higher global warming potential than CO2. On a 100-year basis, it's 25, but it only lives in the atmosphere about for 12 years. It's actually part of a biogenic cycle, so it gets cleaned by things called hydroxy radicals that convert the methane back into CO2, and so it's considered what we consider a short-lived gas. That's both good and bad. Bad as in that why it's there, it's quite a higher level of warming. When it's averaged out over 100 years, it's 25. Good in that we've actually got a way to actually contribute to climate cooling if we can reduce our methane contribution and get that graph on the bottom there to turn the other way. CO2 is a long-lived gas. It does have variable, but generally considered a long-lived gas. The disadvantage of that is once we've done that, there's no turn back from that point of view. So when we talk about being locked into 1.5 or 2 degrees warming, that's what it is. You just can't wake up tomorrow and say, I'll take that back, thanks. So methane, we'll jump into that because that's, I think, what we want to talk about, and hopefully today give you some context and then highlight some of the areas of research that we're involved with. This is how the University of California, as part of the biogenic cycle, which is an important message. So animals consume carbon when they eat grass, they produce methane. Most of that is eructed out through the breath, 95%, so don't go blaming the cow farts, blame the cow burps. Is the take home out of that. And then part of that is said it's a 12-year cycle, gets cleaned, go back in, and there we go. So the argument for us as livestock farmers is that if we're not putting out any more methane than we did 12 years ago, then we've contributed no more to global warming. That is factual. However, it's also grandfathering your responsibilities and emissions. And I think sometimes we like to hear the messages we want. The reality is that however methane's going up in the atmosphere, I think anyone who's got a contribution, whether it's CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, to look at solutions to help minimise that. So that's an important message. People tell facts, but we've got to balance both sides of the coin, I think. On the flip side of around methane, it is an opportunity. We've known for quite some time that it's a lost energy process, and the school of thought has always been if we can abate that methane, then that saved energy should result in increased productivity. I'm here to discuss why that's a bigger challenge than we originally first thought. I want to go too much into details around ruminant nutrition. This has been quite a learning curve for me over the last 3 or 4 years, and it's much more equipped ruminant nutritionists that could talk to this than me. I'm just a grass guy, really. But what happens is, really, cows come along, as we know, and they eat, and they get in the ruminant environment, and they produce what's called volatile fatty acids. About 70% of the feed that we extract energy from, in a sense, to support growth comes from volatile fatty acids that pass over the rumen wall. One of the outcomes of that is that we also produce hydrogen that sits in the rumen environment and needs to actually get out. The way that's done that through the combination of methanogens that combine the hydrogen with the CO2 to produce methane. We're actually trying to overcome that, which is, in a way, fighting evolution. One of those challenges is what happens to that hydrogen when it gets blocked. The other bit is how much. So every time a cow eats, it pretty much produces the same amount of methane irrespective of what it's eating at the time, unless it's on a feedlot diet. So this is work whether we're talking about up in the northern tropics, we're talking Brahman cattle, or we're talking down here in our temperate environments. We're talking some of our dairy cows that are eating 20 kilos. You can see all those data points. This is Ed Chamley's work that's in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. For every kilo of feed we eat, we produce about 20 grams of methane, or 20.7 grams of methane. You can see there's a bit of a spread there. That's associated with diet, things like rate of passage, and it's more spread the more we eat. So there is an opportunity, and there's some good work being done around things like breeding and how we can understand that, and I'll talk about it. What I wanted you to take out of this slide was 2 things. One is, as we produce those VFAs, we've got a hydrogen level to deal with, and the second is how much is that methane actually, if we put a dollar value on it. I think Pieter will talk later about the cows here as part of the farmlets. They're eating about 6 tonnes feed a year, Pieter, at the moment. To give you some context, if we benchmark that, and Karen's in the audience, when we do our benchmarking program around greenhouse gas emissions, we don't actually come out and measure your methane emissions from your cows. We actually work out how much they've eaten. So based on your production, how many animals you've got, what size, what diet, we get an estimate of how many kilos of dry matter or tonnes of dry matter they've eaten for that lactation. We then convert that by that line in the bottom, and I really want to turn around, but I know Esther's in here ringing it. But that's worth about 124 kilos of methane a year. We convert that to CO2 equivalents using that global warming potential of 25 that I just shown, and that gives us about 3.5 tonnes of CO2 equivalents to a standard dairy cow that's producing pretty good milk solids and eating 6 tonnes of feed a year. If you go to the market and said, I wanted to offset that, and I'll talk briefly on offsetting versus insetting. So if you went and bought carbon credits off someone that are being sold for $40 an ACCU, that's an Australian carbon credit unit, pretty much works out a cost of 45 cents a cow a day. So that's the opportunity. That's what a cow's producing roughly in methane a day on a carbon market. Okay, so what can you do as farmers? What can you do now? What makes sense for us to do now? So I'll talk on just 2 examples of what we can do now that makes sense. I'm sure plenty of farms in the audience, and we've seen the direction of that. It's mostly associated with efficiencies on farm. It's not surprising when we do the benchmarking. Some of our most efficient farms have the lowest embedded emissions in their litre of milk. And that's one of the differentiations as well. Here we're talking about emissions intensity or net emissions. So I'll just work through that quickly. 2 examples, same size farm, only small farms because it makes the maths easier. 100 cow farms, body weight 500 kilos. Their milk solids productions are either 400 or 500. So they're either doing 80% of their body weight in milk solids, or they're doing 100% of their body weight in milk solids. So that's what that represents. Total farm emissions then becomes 4,000 kilos of milk, 40,000 kilos of milk solid, or becomes 50,000 kilos of milk solid. You can see that line there, and I should have used some animations, but I'll point to the third one up. Our net emissions actually go up as we produce more milk. Why? Because animals had to eat more. Okay, so our net emissions have gone through 320 tonnes of CO2 equivalents for those 100 cows to 354. So we've gone up 10%. So that's what the globe sees. We say, well, that's not great. That's gone up. But if we don't produce that milk, someone else will. And that's what's called displacement. So if you stop emissions in one place, they can end up somewhere else. What we try to do is actually, as I said, try to feed a globe with a lower footprint. So emissions intensity becomes a very key metric for us, which is the amount of emissions that's in a litre of milk, which is the standard fat protein corrected milk down the bottom, or because we talk about milk solids, I've also got it there on milk solids, but it'll be the same. Our emissions intensity actually has gone down by 11.5%, which is a good result. By being more efficient in the way we've been able to convert feed into product or into milk, we've actually lowered the amount of emissions in that milk. Why? Because we've diluted out the emissions associated with maintenance. Okay, the emissions associated with that 500 kilo cow, she has the same maintenance bill whether she's producing 400 milk solids or 500. So there's a level of efficiencies that we need to get out of our animals that make sense. We've got to be mindful that we don't push those animals into a production system that goes beyond what's profitable, but I think we also need to be aware that having animals running around that aren't producing near what they should, then we've probably got an opportunity there. One of the other areas is around repro performance. This one has the benefit that it's all net, it's both a reduction in net emissions and emissions intensity. So again, same farm, this time they're both on 500 kilos of milk solids. So you remember that number 354, that's associated with the milk production side. But what about the replacement stock for those cows? If we're running 30% replacement, we're running 30 R2s and 30 R1s. That's rising 2s and rising 1-year-olds. The rising 2s have a emissions footprint of 45 tonnes of CO2. When we've got 30 of them, they've got 21 went for the rising 1s in that 12-month cycle. Obviously, if we're running less than them, we reduce it. So that gives us about a 5.5% reduction. So these are some of the things that we see in the benchmarking. These are some of the things we advocate straight away as make sense. They're the win-win solutions. They should make you more profitable. You're not giving up milk, and we get a lower emissions in our feed, in our milk production. But can we achieve a step change, particularly for a grass-fed system? There's probably 3 big ticket items, and I'm sure John, DA's invested in areas here and continue to, and very much support that. Some great work. Vaccines have been promised for a long time. I don't think we should stop investing in that area, but it's not an easy path. Been going on for a few decades now, and we get closer each day, but we don't have a solution that's rolled out. Breeding is one of those solutions, finding low emitting cows. So cows that don't produce 20.7 grams every time they eat a kilo of feed, those that inherently produce lower. Can we find the heritability of those traits, identify those traits and breed for them? Those things are going to compound year on year, but they're going to take us a while to get there, to actually make that a substantial number. And then we've heard a lot about feed additives, both in the media and things that people adopt. And they're the here and now, and I just wanted to chat a little bit about them and some of the work that we're doing. So additives can be broadly classified into 2 lots for mine. They're the ones that modify the rumen and those that inhibit methane. Those that modify the rumen generally result in a favourable change in the rumen environment. In addition to decreasing methane, they also have improved animal performance and health. However, they don't offer the high levels of abatement that we're probably going to need to find in time. So they're our 5 and 10%ers. I tend to think of them a bit like a catalytic converter. Still got the exhaust, still got the emissions coming out, but the car runs a bit smoother and the emissions are a bit lower. When it comes to inhibitors, they have a much greater potential to stop methane. However, that removal of that hydrogen is essential as its accumulation can inhibit many of the biological functions, particularly fermentation of feed and maintaining a rumen ecosystem. So in essence, and one of the analogies that's been given is like a banana and exhaust pipe. And John Penry, I didn't know this was one of your hobbies, but but apparently it is. So that's the challenge for that one. Is I want to talk a little bit about that in a bit more detail. So one of the bits around that is as we inhibit methane, we've got to overcome 2 things. One is the ability for fermentation to continue, and the other one is to convert that into a productivity benefit. This is a meta-analysis that was done on all the work around methane inhibition, a meta-analysis put by Emilio Ungerfeld. I highlighted 2 bits. One is that inhibiting rumen methanogenesis, really I should put these on, but tends to associate positively with milk production efficiencies. So not surprisingly, that is part of that hydrogen can find its way into improved production, but part of that hydrogen doesn't. And what happens in that regards is we actually inhibit and associate it with reduced dry matter intake. So if we've got an animal that's eating 20 kilos of dry matter and we come along and inhibit methane to a point, she might eat a kilo less and continue to produce the same. We've got improved feed conversion efficiency. If we push that too hard, we need to be mindful that we might actually reduce dry matter intake to a point that makes it, that the production declines. And I think that's probably the key area that we've got to focus in on. This diagram here explained it best for mine. It's probably a little bit complex and I will walk through it slowly if I've got time. So the top one in the blue is, and again, this is Amelia Ungerfeld's work, is the normal scenario that we've got without any feed additive. So the animal has a state in the rumen where we've got what's called reductive and oxidised cofactors. So they're the cogs that drive fermentation. We've got a hydrogen aqueous pool, and then we've got the outputs. The outputs to the right are the hydrogen gas. You can see that's quite small. We've got methane, which is reasonably large, the CH4, and then we've got other hydrogen sinks. In the middle, we've got part B, which is in the orange, and that's when we actually feed a feed additive that's quite effective at inhibiting methane. So we're talking more than our 5-10% here. We're talking quite significant blockers, you know, the 50-60% blocking. We get a lot bigger reduction in the methane, which is that middle arrow coming out. The hydrogen gas that gets eructed out has also gone up. We get a little bit to the hydrogen sinks, which can lead to productivity, but we get this bigger ball of H gas in the middle of the room. So that changes the partial pressure, changes those states between our oxidised and reductive cofactors, and we inhibit some of the fermentation. The key question is C. How do we actually overcome that? So in C, which is the green, you can see that methane stayed lower, hydrogen gas, which is the first arrow, methane's the middle arrow, have stayed lower, and other sinks have taken a lot. So how do we create new hydrogen sinks in the environment that actually take that hydrogen away and stop that impact that we're seeing on fermentation? And that's a lot of the work that we're trying to focus in on. I think if we're able to achieve that, we'll overcome what I see as maybe the biggest challenges to feed additive adoption that we've got at the moment, and that is that it's not cheap to produce these feed additives. Comes at a cost, and we often relate that in terms of cents per cow per day. So if we just take the scenario of something that's costing us 40 cents a day to feed to our cows, we'd need to get 90% of methane abatement reduction to get a carbon value of $38. So that's about on parity with what the carbon value. If it's costing us 40 cents a day and we're only getting 30 cents abatement, that carbon value has cost us about $115 to produce. So that's what those numbers in the table are. That's how much it's costing us to create that carbon abatement. Okay? So the best scenario is an inhibitor that's cheap and produces a lot. You know, the one that's costs us 10 cents a cow a day and does 90%, that carbon value is only costing us 10, so it's a lot less than what it would be if you just went and bought an offset. So what's going to drive adoption? The big bit that's going to drive adoption is productivity uptick. And I think we probably missed the importance of that in some of our work at this point in time, because in the absence of it, voluntary uptake of methane inhibitors will remain low, and there's currently a significant gap between the cost of inclusion and that carbon value. This has been the focus of a fair bit of our work in the last 2 or 3 years, and got some of my colleagues, Apay and Ibrahim in the back, done some great work down in Launceston with sheep studies. And we've been screening not to find new inhibitors, but working primarily over understanding this challenge that it confronts, particularly when we're chasing high levels of methane abatement. So we're looking at the role of co-supplements in combination with proven methane inhibitors to act as hydrogen acceptors. We're building our capability quite a bit in terms of our ability to measure that. Some of the equipment on display out here, John talked about the research facility. It's fantastic for the way we're able to get a lot of data associated with cow behaviour, cow productivity measures, individual milk monitoring, walkover weighing, body condition. One of the things we're attempting to build with support of Mike and the team is our ability to measure methane. So whether that's sniffers at the bale, green feeders in the paddock, and so we're on a path of increasing that. We've also been fortunate to recently acquire support through the Beef Trust to get what's called an OptiWeigh with an AgScent unit, and we're doing some work, Rowan Smith, on beef cattle, so we're very much looking forward to that commencing. And then, yeah, like I said, we've got a little bit of work done down at Mount Pleasant sheep. So our steps are we screen, we then evaluate those most prominent solutions in small ruminants and control feeding studies. Again, Small ruminants are a lot cheaper to run and a lot easier to handle than large ruminants. But then we will actually want to go out and test that in a setting that replicates or mimics certainly what we see in our farming systems, and this facility is well set up for that. So we're moving to large ruminant valuations at grazing, and pleased to say that our study for that will commence this year, the start of spring. So hopefully come along next year, and might be Ibrahim and Apave and get up and talk about the results of some of that great work that they're doing.
You had a graph up there that showed the fat and protein corrected milk and the amount of CO2 equivalent. How much of that, sometimes you see the whole farm and it's a good bit higher, it might be about 1 kilo instead of 0.5 or 0.6. It's hard to read at the bottom there, but...
This one?
Yeah, the very bottom one. When you see the whole farm amount, that includes other sources than just enteric methane, is that right?
Yeah. So this is just the emissions intensity of enteric methane. On average, we're a little bit below 1, and about 60% comes from enteric methane. So the column on the left there, you can see it's 0.58. So our methane sources, enteric methane sources make up close to 60% of our footprint that's in a total litre of milk. We've also got methane associated with manure management. You've also got embedded emissions associated with things you've brought onto the farm. You've got your nitrous oxide emissions. So they make up roughly about the other 40%. And so that takes us close to that 1 kilo of CO2 equivalents per litre of milk. Now, as an industry average, we're a little bit lower than that. I'm not sure if Karen's in the audience, but we've got allocation to meet and the like. I think we're about 0.88 or something. Where's Karen? About 0.92. 0.92, yeah, okay. Yeah, 0.92. So that's, but yeah, the 0.58 is only for the emissions associated with enteric methane. When I went to the next slide, Rory, you can see that I've added in the emissions associated with raising the stock. Okay, so the 354 is still there, but then there's the amount of emissions associated with running your rising 2s and rising 1s. And just highlighting that can be lowered by having a lower replacement rate, which is obviously dependent on having good repro performance and less unproductive animals in the herd.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Richard.
No, thank you, Leslie.
I would now like to introduce Hannah Sadler. So Hannah works for Cradle Coast NRM and is working with the research facility here, looking at natural capital accounting, and she's going to share a little bit about that work that's happening here at the moment.
Thank you, Leslie. Yes, so as Leslie said, my name's Hannah. So some of you may have had experience with some of the NRMs previously. So Cradle Coast NRM is based on the northwest, extend over to King Island, Devonport, cut through the middle of Cradle Mountain and the far west coast. There's a couple of guys here from NRM North who sort of have the northeast, and then there's NRM South in the south of the state. So personally, I grew up in Flowerdale on a dairy farm, and I know some of you in the room through that experience. That's really nice. So over the years I've been working in various natural resource management activity things around the region, and I'm working back in ag space in the last year, and it's been really great to work alongside the TS staff in undertaking a demonstration on the farm here. Big thank you to James and Andrew and Mike Rose here for sort of letting us look at a practical demonstration on the farm. So I'll try to explain what's going on here in a quick snapshot, but feel free to chat to myself or Tom and Ben afterwards about what I'm talking about, in case this is a brand new concept for you. So just acknowledging that previously, this land that we're on has been managed for 40,000 years, actively managed by people here, and our aspiration is to make sure that our practices allow us to manage this land for another 40,000. Game on, I say. So this is part of this demonstration that we're doing at the TF farm is part of a broader program that we've been funded by the federal government to undertake through the Climate Smart Ag program. So the whole Climate Smart Ag program looks at adopting practices to reduce emissions and build resilience to climate change, all the stuff that Richard has already been talking about, and also Professor Mike Rose this morning. Looking at driving agricultural growth while also adopting sustainable natural resource management practices that protect and conserve natural capital and biodiversity, And also the agricultural sector is supported to harness carbon and biodiversity incentives and implement industry sustainability frameworks. So the dairy industry has its Australian Dairy Sustainability Framework, and a lot of the suppliers have their own sort of sustainability targets and goals that they're aspiring to. So as part of this broader project, we're doing a few demonstrations, including this one on the farm, but we also have some opportunities to support farmers one-on-one, offer some small incentives for programs on farms, and develop some communications resources. So what is natural capital? And this is what this demonstration is all about. So it's basically the natural assets on your farm that you have: water, vegetation, soils, biodiversity, which support the agricultural productivity and environmental sustainability on your farm. So this is nothing new, it's a change in terms basically. So forever you may have been, forever farmers have been managing their natural assets on their property. The term natural capital and having trees and soils being termed as an asset is an economic term. So it's basically thinking about how they can contribute to the broader management of your production operations. So forever ecologists are being frustrated because economists and business people don't understand about the values that they have around plants and animals and stuff like this. This is bringing the two terms together and thinking about how do these assets that aren't the traditional things that you might think about making the milk on your property, but how can they contribute to the broader profitability and production on your property? And so these assets already provide essential services like filtration, making sure you have clean water, the soil's healthy so that it's not degrading and that you can keep growing really good grass, looking at shelter and stock protection around trees and stuff like that. So all stuff that you're already thinking about, but just reframing it basically going forward. Why is this suddenly on everyone's mind, as it has come up a few times today? Climate change is driving a lot of this, and also people are very aware of what's going on. So there's new export rules that might be associated with markets to different places. I'm not going to go into all of these because I've only got a little slot here, but thinking about climate policy, premium market opportunities, these sustainability frameworks that the dairy industry has, or that different suppliers might have. There's some examples of people in the room here that are already doing, looking at some premium opportunities associated with some of this stuff. So you can see here that the Dairy Sustainability Framework, people who can get certified regenerative agriculture. A lot of our Woolworths, for example, is looking at various drivers of biodiversity on farms. Even banks and insurance companies are looking at some of these things as well. So what are we actually doing? So we're doing a demonstration with the Tier farm here, also in partnership with Fonterra, because the Tier farm supplies their milk to Fonterra, and so we want to make sure that what we're doing here aligns with their suppliers' expectations around environmental management. So practically, we want to show farmers some of the opportunities that might exist around managing their natural assets on their property beyond just the production goals. So in this instance, we're actually undertaking an account looking at the vegetation and the soils on this property, and then we're using a framework called the Accounting for Nature framework, and that sets up a baseline. And this whole demonstration is basically, it's not research, this is an existing system that's already out there, but it's about demonstrating to farmers about how this actually works, why you would even thinking about doing it, what the economic and or production benefits might be for farmers. So basically we are looking, so we've chosen to look at just soils and vegetation in this demonstration. You can measure all sorts of different things. Soils and vegetation are the easiest things to measure. The Tier farm already has some amazing soils data, as you can imagine, as a research farm. and also vegetation doesn't run away. So, you know, you could measure different animals or you can measure water quality, but that is a lot more variable and costs a bit more money to gather the data. So we're just looking at developing a baseline for vegetation and soil, and then from there, we want to register that as a certified baseline, like you would with a carbon account, and then look at opportunities with the TS staff about how they might want to improve that vegetation and or soil health, and there might be opportunities or there might not. And then over a few years later, we can actually measure and see if there is an uptick in that value. And that we can either use that as a premium market opportunity. So instead of just saying, oh yeah, we manage our vegetation, here's a photo of it, you can actually have it certified and say, yep, someone else has come out and they've checked what we've done and they can confirm that yes, they really are managing their soil and yes, they really are managing their vegetation. And then there's also market opportunities associated with that. So like there is a carbon market, there are existing biodiversity markets that do exist right now, and there's also the Australian government is in discussion around the nature repair market, so there might be increasing opportunities for actually getting paid for biodiversity credits. So what we've been up to, so this is literally last week, we've just been out on the farm. We initially did a little look around, we're like, okay, what are the assets? We've got these awesome patches of vegetation that run along the edge of the creek line, we've got a couple of dams, some cool patches of tall eucalypts and some farm shade trees and stuff like that. As we've said, we've got some amazing pasture, some really good some soils and stuff and some really good soil data. So we've gone around and we've worked out what exists, and then through the accounting for nature methodology, you've got a set amount of data collection that you have to do to make sure that you've got that baseline to start with, and that you're representative of the different types of vegetation that you have. So there's different types of recipes that might exist depending on what you're measuring. As I said, we're doing vegetation, so there's already a recipe around how you have to go about measuring vegetation in Tasmania. And then, so what we're looking at for actual opportunities, so there's an existing, excuse me, accounting for nature framework, which is what we're using, and we are looking at opportunities to also align with Nature Plus biodiversity credits. And then, as I said, the Australian government is thinking about the nature repair market, and there's the initial introductory legislation's already gone through, but they haven't kind of finalised how that might look. There's also international markets that exist, including Verdon vistas and wilderlands, and they've been around for a while. None of these are a required thing, but they're an opportunity basically at this stage. So why would you bother doing this? This is an example. So we're using this is all new to me as it is to you. We've had a guy called Matt Taylor who's is a Tasmanian originally. He's now working in Queensland. He's done a lot of work with natural capital accounting, and he's worked with these guys in Queensland, which are basically a big grazing operation, and they supply their beef to the European market. And like I said, you know, it wasn't enough to just say, yeah, we're really looking after our vegetation on our property, really looking after the soils. So it's given them an opportunity to actually have a verified account that they share with their market, and then they can attract a premium basically for their beef product, and reassure the markets that they, you know, there's a lot of controversy about people making claims around greenwashing, and then, you know, people can lose their reputation basically if they're found to be not doing the right thing. So in this case, they've got this verified account that they use basically to attract a premium market. Another example in Tassie is Foraco, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, is a large forestry operation. So they've been using natural capital accounting since 2020 basically to verify their management of their natural assets. So they have a lot of native forestry, but they also have, and conservation areas, and they also have plantation forestry. So they use the accounts to verify and maintain market access for their products. So basically what we're doing going forward is we're literally at ground zero right now, literally gathering the data last week and getting my head around what this account actually will be and exist and how it might work for all of us. But we want to basically bring farmers along, bring people along just to sort of think about whether or not this actually might be an opportunity for you. I know that there's a lot of really proactive farmers. This is not for everyone, and so we want to be able to verify what this will actually practically cost for a farmer, why you would bother doing it, what the market opportunities are and how they might evolve, and then what kind of practical actions we can take to get that uptick in base level natural capital. So with this example that on this farm, even walking around with Andrew, the farm manager, we're looking at opportunities like fencing off small areas of existing vegetation. There's some patches where there's like a lot of blackberries, and talking to Matt Taylor, the ecologist who's had experience in this area, we can get quite significant upticks in the score. So one thing I didn't say, sorry, with the accounting for nature methodology, you get a score from 0 to 100 for your asset. So your vegetation might, if it was 0, would be really poor, and 100 is perfect. So depending on what it is, you might have an opportunity to really improve that or not. But something simple like getting rid of the blackberries within an existing patch of vegetation, or doing a bit of work on revegetation along the creekline, can show quite a marked uptick in natural capital value. And then within the biodiversity market, I think you get paid based on every hectare, I think, or 10% improvement you might be able to show over a period of time. So we're looking at initially submitting our account initially, and then looking at wherever our budget might end in 3 or 4 years' time, and seeing if we can do some activities like weed control and a bit of revegetation to improve the vegetation on the farm. So if you want to find out a bit more, please, and keep up to date with how this might progress, just put your name down on the sheet over here and come and chat to us after. But it's literally at its start right now and evolving as we speak. But thanks so much for Tia for being enthusiastically doing this demonstration with us, and also Fonterra and Dairy Tas for supporting this kind of concept. So thanks very much.
So thank you very much, Hannah. I think this is a really exciting space, because in all the years that I've worked with dairy farmers, I know there is a natural appreciation for the environment that they're working in, and this is one way of being able to maybe get some appreciation for all the work that they do to look after the land that they're farming on, but also being able to demonstrate what they're actually doing on their farm. So I think it's really interesting. So make sure you take the opportunity to catch up with the team later. So we have one final presentation before we break for lunch. So this afternoon we're going to be going out and looking at some of the farmlet research paddocks. And so just to give you an introduction to the farmlets, I'm going to invite Pieter Raedts to come and present about, just given a summary of where things are at with the farmlet research.
I'm going to talk a little bit about results so far, preliminary findings of our farmlet trial. A trial like this, which runs over multiple years, is not possible if you're not doing it with a whole team. So it is not about one person, it is about a team. I thank everybody involved in making this possible. Also the farm staff, they also play a crucial role in making this all work. If you want to see as a system what's actually happening on the farm and try different ways of running systems, you have to do that over multiple years. And this trial is going to run over 3 years. We are actually halfway now. Dairy Australia has recently funded that last extra year that we needed to make this full 3 years possible. So thanks for that. I'll try and get through as much as I can before you have your lunch. So this trial is about reducing nitrogen from a conventional level, even down to zero, whilst increasing the species mix in your paddocks. We will, in this system, rely a lot on clover. So that's a very important driver of what's happening here is our observation so far. This afternoon, when you are separated in groups and also go to the paddocks, Rowan Smith will explain about legumes and clover and everything involved. So everything you want to know is for Rowan a bit later. Farmlet 4 runs at zero nitrogen. It is a farmlet with the most diverse species mix. It's more a regen egg type of system that we run over there. Dairy Australia has funded an additional project investigating what is happening in the soil. And this afternoon, again, a station will be talking about that, and James Hills will be leading that section. And I'll be in a paddock too, just looking at the paddocks and talking about challenges and so on that we run into. So I'll be one of them too. Okay, that is how it should look like. We always hope that it is approximately like that, but that's where it runs to. So we are aiming for a certain amount of clover in the paddocks. You see the amounts here, roughly 20% of clover in the first two farmlets. Farmlet 1 has 300 and the farmlet 2 and 3 have half that amount, and farmlet 4, 0. Farmlet 3 was intended to be a little bit more clover and a significant amount of plantain in there, and then farmlet 4 also 30% clover and a fair bit of plantain. It turns out that we can't keep the plantain in. That's one of the first learnings that we have had. What you also see, the results as we have it now, clover always varies, is at about 30% for the first three farmlets and getting towards 40%. So that varies in farmlets somewhere between 15 and 50-55%. So a fair bit of variation in it. Note also in farmlet 4 that cocksfoot is getting higher, and you will see that cocksfoot is becoming a component in here. Is probably not the most suitable for a fully irrigated system, but we can talk about that in a paddock. Growth rates. So this was the first year, full season. So this was last season. Keep in mind, fully irrigated. And as you can see, the black line roughly indicates where we have our break even for the farmlets, which have a high stocking rate. And we have moments when it drops a little bit below, and we have moments when it is a bit higher. Start of season, end of season, of course, lower. The red arrow indicates when our milking cows go on the platform, and we collect that data. This is how we sit this year. Something similar, not really that different from last year's, just at different times of the year have now different results. So if I overlay that, you see that same kind of curve where there's periods of good growth, periods of a reduction around Christmas. So that's roughly in the middle where you see a dip. That seems to be happening a bit stronger in ours than you might experience on your farms. The red circles are where we this year produce less than last year, and I'll get to that in a sec. How much did we grow? Last year we got to about 20 ton dry matter grown per hectare, or just above, with the amount of fertilizer mentioned here. So we stayed below the cap that we had, roughly just over 70% homegrown feed gone into the cows, probably 17.5 ton utilized is what we estimate, including silage. I'll show some data later that talks about Eton, which is not what we utilize, it's a little bit higher. This year is the solid lines just below where we sat last year. We are in more or less the same trajectory. We sit a tiny little bit lower. Not every year is the same. What we have had so far is slightly less days on the farmlet paddocks. We started off a bit slower, so there's a slightly later start. Our prize is handed out at the finish, so we'll see where we are at the end. So I hope we get very close to last year, but not every year is the same year. And that is indicated here. Karen did some modeling for us. This is just an initial modeling. It always takes a while before the amount of legumes can be controlled a little bit in that modeling, but this is looking at what last year and this year the growth potential was, using actual weather data up to the end of January. And as you can see, these two red red circles were the periods that this year we had below last year's growth rates, and that's what the modeling actually shows. The wet time in September was one culprit, and November the conditions were also poorer, and that showed in our data too. Roughly, what we achieve is what theoretical modeling shows is possible. So we sit very high in that maximum growth rate. So anyway, that's where we are at. Milk production, so this trial is set out with a productivity focus. Can we maintain productivity when nitrogen fertilizer is reduced? And also, can we keep milk production up? What we were aiming for is 2,000 kilos. Last season, we set about 2.4 ton milk solids per hectare, so we achieved that. The green is farmlet 4, and the only difference for farmlet 4 is a lower stocking rate. If you don't put nitrogen in paddocks, pasture doesn't grow, is what we assume as well, at least. So we had a comparative stocking rate that was set a little bit lower. That's the only reason. Cow production the same. It can grow very close to at least what we have had so far, but that's the only reason why it's different. This year so far, again, we are more or less on the same trajectory, but a little bit behind because our cows went on the farm slightly later. What is the quality that we grow in the paddocks? This is last year's data, samples taken pre-grazing, so this does include the odd paddock that will be made into silage. I haven't separated it out, it is all data. Most important part is that there's a lot of nitrogen going around in our system to enable that pasture growth. On average, we have 23.5% crude protein in our grass before cows go in. There's no difference between the paddocks. So the clover is bringing in a fair bit of nitrogen, is what we assume is the main reason behind this. What we did do, and this recent data, and this just exploratory, we grab a lot of pasture samples. One of them is what we call BOTCOM botanic composition samples, where we keep ryegrass and clover and so on separate. We went back to these samples from last year, 4 paddocks combined ryegrass in farmlet 1 and clover combined. We did that for farmlet 2, so 1 is 300 N, 4 is 0 N per year. And what you see is that in both situations, crude protein in ryegrass is lower than in clover. Clover on the roots and the nodules, rhizobia, fix nitrogen out of the air if they all function well. And you can see that clover brings in a lot of protein, a lot of nitrogen. That is then recycled through the cows back into the paddock, and that makes your grass grow. And as you can see, in both farmlets we see something similar, although the difference between ryegrass and clover is larger than in farmlet 4. How can these N flows work? These are postulations. We don't know that in detail, but what we know is the bottom line. We have 23.5% crude protein in our grass. To make a regrowth of 1,500 kilos drum matter possible, residual 15 cows go in at 3, or residual 16 the cows go in at 3.1, then you need about 56 or so kilos nitrogen to make that possible. Where can that be coming from? We chuck in 30 or 15 or 0. The cows recycle, and what I have here is an assumption of about 6 kilos per cow stocking rate per round. That is based on European data, where they have looked into that a fair bit. And then we have to assume a certain amount from clover, and that's when we can get there. What you do see is that in farmlet 1, clover is assumed to bring in a little bit, and it turns out that it indeed is. I'll talk about that in a second very briefly. Farmlet 2 and 3, we expect clover to do a bit. It has to do about 18 kilos or so. You would more expect 15, but hey, that seems to be about okay. Farmlet 4, however, has to do 34 kilos. I already have the nitrogen out of the cows at a higher use efficiency. The nitrogen recycled by cows does not have to compete with the nitrogen fertilizer. Even if I would do that, I need almost 35 kilos of N. Based on the botanic composition and our rule of thumb that we have, one would expect 25 kilos of nitrogen from clover. So there's still a bit of an unanswered gap. So for me, this indicates a little bit, if we want these lower end system and have a legume supporting that, there's two triggers. That is the amount of clover you have in there and how active these rhizobia can bind and out of the air. It's probably these two that we have to have control of one way or another to achieve what we are trying to achieve. The rhizobia inoculation that we use is a standard one. We are very happy with it, but there is some variation in it and some options available maybe in the future. Anyway, to get to 23, it could be like this, it can be different, and we still have a year and a half to look at it in more detail. We had an intern from the Netherlands visiting us for a few months. She did a project looking at nodules and activity of these nodules in the different farmlets. And what she did find is activity of rhizobia in farmlet 1. And that's why I did have something in there. Tori, I'm not sure if she is here. She was involved in that project. If she is here, I don't think she is at the moment, but she can answer more questions on it. What we also did, and the ink of this is not dry, so we are still getting our head around on all the data that is in there. We did an initial benchmarking, also looking at financials. We used the FarmX system from New Zealand for that. The input data that we used still needs a lot of workshopping going into the future. One of the things that we found out is that FarmX cannot handle this high productivity system. The models they use can't deal with it, and they encountered that with another farm where the cows do a high production. The system can't handle that. Will still work on, and they are still working out if there's options for that. The input costs, the fixed costs and so on, we used an inference from the Dairy Farm Monitoring Project from Tasmania, where Simon was talking about, wasn't available yet when we started, so that is the 1 or 2 years before when the inflation was almost there. The variable cost, we used reasonable prices for last year, so that is focusing on last season, this modeling, reasonable prices from last year, so not the inflated prices at the end when everything had dried out and was a shortage, but the variable costs are fairly okay as far as we can see. Benchmarked with high-performing farms from New Zealand. Keep in mind when we talk about the farmlet cows, we only count milk production when they are in the farmlet herd. If a cow is in a rest paddock because she has stepped on a stone or so or has mastitis, that milk is not accounted for in this system. It's only the salt milk, to put it simple. What is different? Labor cost is a per cow cost. Farmlet 4 therefore will be a bit lower. Nitrogen fertilizer, of course, varies. And again, we are ignoring greenhouse gas costs, but there can be some greenhouse gas advantages. Farmlet 4 has slightly different costs in fertilizer, actually slightly higher. That's the choice of the fertilizer and the fact that we lock up nutrients in silage that is sold and that has to be replaced. Blow drench with that amount of clover. What we chose to do is Farmlet 1.0 because you normally wouldn't expect to need it, and Farmlet 4 full year and Farmlet 2 and 3 somewhere in between. And we ramped up the irrigation cost because it is 100% irrigated and dairy farm monitoring isn't. Some key data. First of all, we had to look at the intake, and as Richard said, at the bottom somewhere you see, so focus on the brown rows, so about 6,000 kilos dry matter intake. What we then get is a feed conversion of 9.5 in solids, or in liters fat protein corrected milk per kilo dry matter of 1.41. If I look at TMR-based diets, I looked at some recent data, farms doing 33 liters or so run at a feed conversion efficiency of 1.44. So dry matter-wise, you can't get better. TMR cows don't have to walk to the paddock, ours do. And only if you go higher in milk yield, you get better results. So this is a decent feed conversion efficiency. You see the results in milk solids per cow and per hectare. Per cow, we do about 1.15 solids here in this when they are on the farmlets. And the cows themselves actually do a little bit more. We only draft them into the farmlets when they're already about 3 weeks in lactation, but that's a slightly different story. We do feed about 1.4 ton concentrate. That's what these cows need to kind of do what they do, eating 16, 17 kilogram at a pasture. That's what you get. Pasture eaten in total is mentioned here. In the end, we have a good intake, but a very efficient production system. If I then look at a couple of other parameters enlarged here you see the milk solids, the supplements as intake compared to the DSM average. So our cows outperform these. We have a higher stocking rate. We have a higher pasture production that enables that higher stocking rate. Our cows produce so well that as a consequence of it, these cows also have a higher concentrate intake than they have. They offer less supplements, about just below 700 kilos. We are at about 1800 or so, but that is including silage. So the concentrate is 1.4 of that per cow. So we import more silage because of the higher production that our cows have. They then have a supplement concentrate plus silage of only 15. We are about 33, but homegrown feed is less than 30%. So the homegrown feed is still above our 70%. And Simon was showing results for Tasmania that are not achieving that. Nitrogen use, you see that we in 2 farmlets are just below what New Zealand has. Keep in mind that our farmlet 1 per ton dry matter might not be that far off from what New Zealand does. Anyway, financials. The top line is the most important one. What you suddenly see, and as I mentioned, the input data bench that will need workshopping, and these numbers will change a little bit over time, and what do you choose for what? But actually per kilo milk solids, there wasn't really that much of a difference. The main reason for that is that the higher production per cow dilutes your fixed costs. That's the main reason. So per cow you feed a bit more, but per liter of milk or kilo of milk solids you dilute a fair bit. And one example is kilos of concentrate. So it's not uncommon for farms here in Tasmania to feed 1,500 kilos to cows that only produce 5,000 liters of milk. And then they might complain about TMR farms feeding 3,000 kilos of concentrate to their cows, but they produce 10,000 liters of milk. So per liter of milk is actually the same amount of concentrate. That's not exactly what we achieve here, but the dilution plays a very important role in this. So that was actually an interesting finding. What I then did, what milk price do you take? I said either $7, $8 or $9, and you see the numbers here. It does show that because our milk solids production is about 1.5 times what these DSM farms do in farmlets 1, 2, 3, and it's still 1.2 above DSM farms in farmlet 4, it is the milk solids per hectare that ultimately make the biggest difference. So it does turn out to be also a profitable system if you look at what we run. The differences between farmlet 1, 2 and 3 are not that large because the change we make is only nitrogen fertilizer, and you probably have to put a bit of blow drench in when Clover takes over, but there are some smaller differences. But they are too small to really pull apart at this point in time. We need the full 3-year data to have a look at this. So keep in mind that what we do here, and that's talking about feed conversion efficiency, and I had that graph over there where you could see that Clover was much better digestible, or that table. One of the things that we also see is that in the average energy concentration that our cows have, it's about 12.3 or 12.4 megajoules. I think that effectively the cows don't get that out of their diet. I think the digestion rate is too fast. Our cows in this Clover system, I'll actually go back to that table to just show where you are at. Here you can see that Clover sits around 13%, 13 megajoule ME. And that the NDF is only below 30, 25, 28 that was analyzed. So this digests so fast that it is in the rumen so short that not all of that ME will be pulled out. So my rule of thumb is the average pasture. I normally don't calculate anything above 12 megajoules. And that is one of the reasons why I think FarmX can't handle it. It assumes these higher qualities and then comes with too low an intake. I think that's slightly different. Back to Richard's story, what's also a consequence of Clover being much better digestible, the amount of methane produced per kilo dry matter might actually also be lower. So that's one of the things that might have side effects. We are not investigating them. But what's happening in these cows with that high quality clover going in actually changes a few things. What we achieve in these cows is an intake that is above 4% of body weight in dry matter. I was talking about these TMR farms. They do about 3.5. The best one, 40 liters per cow, sits at about 3.9% of body weight or thereabouts. Our cows sit higher. That's probably partly thanks to clover that we get them to where they are at. So still a lot to explore. We are only halfway. There's still a year and a half to go. We don't know what the rest of the season will bring. We don't know what next year brings. But so far, there's a decent potential in it from a productivity perspective as well as a financial perspective. But there's a lot of extra angles that we still have to explore over the next few years. This afternoon in a paddock, you can ask more questions, I assume. So that is my story. Conclusion, grown 20 tons seems to be achievable. Milk solids above 2,000 seems to be achievable. Pasture still needs nitrogen. Clover can provide that, but that will be a delicate mix, I think, between the amount of clover and not all conditions. Every soil, every farm can grow the same amount. Would be nice if you have a trigger where the activity of the rhizobia could have some control too in this. If you want to know more, I hope most of you already get the monthly updates, but you can scan this QR code and that gives you access to the page where you can subscribe to them. See you in the paddock.
Thank you very much, Peter. So that brings us to the close of our inside session for today. As Peter said, we're going to be heading out in the paddock after lunch.
Yep, so my name's Rowan Smith. I work out of Launceston and mainly work on our dryland pastures. And a lot of my work and research has been in increasing legume production in dryland pastures for beef and sheep. And it's good to see that dairy are finally cotton on to something and are trying to catch up to what we were trying to do in beef and sheep. So a very, very sort of casual presentation here. I don't really have too much of a set agenda, but I just thought I'd go through some of the features of the couple of legumes in this pasture. And if you've got questions, just fire them at me and we can have a discussion. Although there was, in those mixes that were put up on the board, it was white clover, red clover and strawberry clover. When we look here, we're pretty much in the majority of it is white clover. Under irrigation, white clover is probably our most productive perennial legume that we've got available, with the exception of maybe lucerne in some circumstances, but in a mixed pasture in the high rainfall zone, certainly white clover is our highest producer. It's got some traits that make it pretty well adapted to high rainfall mixed pastures. Its growth habit, when we look at the root system on white clover, it's quite shallow. Okay, I haven't dug that out too well, but generally white clover is probably only using up about sort of 10 to 20 at the most centimetres of soil with its roots. And while we've got moisture within that zone, it's very happy flying along and producing a lot of dry matter. When we do see water deficit within that top 20 centimetres, that's when white clover starts to become stressed. I've had it put to me before that white clover is a bit of a kamikaze plant. It'll keep growing flat stick with a foot to the floor while it's got moisture, and then when the moisture starts to run out, it doesn't really have a capacity to take its foot off, and so it'll just use up that moisture and then pretty much die if it gets to that point. doesn't have a lot of resilience against drought. Because of that moisture deficit, we're starting to see the perenniality of white clover being challenged, and we're starting to see a lot of pastures having to recruit from seed again as we get extended moisture deficit. So that's an interesting change in that dry land but rain-fed systems, particularly through New South Wales and Victoria. Yeah, I guess the other benefit that we always talk about with clovers is its ability to fix nitrogen, and if I hand that around, you'll be able to see the nodules pretty easily on that. Now that nitrogen fixation process, and it's interesting to see what happens in a dairy situation where we have got 300 units of N going on in one of the other farmlets. They do still seem to be nodulating, but whether or not they're actually fixing a lot of nitrogen and putting that into the soil is a little bit hard to tell. And the only way we could really do that is do some nitrogen abundance work and try and identify where that nitrogen is coming from.
So we're looking at biodiversity and the opportunity for biodiversity credits and biodiversity an account, which is slightly different from carbon, where you're actually literally measuring the amount of carbon. So if we were doing, for example, soil carbon, we would have to drill down to a certain depth, and we'd do a lot of data around there. And I know that Tia's got some of that data already. But in this instance, we're actually just looking at the natural values, the vegetation, the soils. As I said before, we're measuring only the vegetation and the soils, but we could be measuring the water quality, or we could be measuring wedge-tailed eagles, or whatever the priority might be. If this was koala habitat, then maybe we'd say, oh, everyone's really interested in koalas. Let's make sure that this farm is looking after its koalas really, really well. But in this instance, the easiest thing to measure is vegetation and soils, because vegetations also give us a really good indication of broader health, because obviously all the animals and it improves water quality and all the rest of it. So if we're looking after our vegetation, then we're often also looking after a lot of the other natural values. So it's a good base to be looking at. And then we've looked at the different types of vegetation. So we've kind of grouped them into groups. I think we ended up having 5 different types. And then depending on what you're measuring, to come up with an actual baseline that would relate to getting a market access, or to verify that that you've got enough data to make a call on whether it's healthy or not. There's a different recipe for different things. So we worked out that we needed to do 5 vegetation condition assessments, and with across 3 different types of vegetation. In the end, we want to see, what does it cost to do this? How practical is it for anyone? Obviously, we have very different scales of farmers across the North West Coast doing different things. Maybe this works for you and you see a benefit for market access, or baselining going forward. Maybe you actually want to look at diverse income streams through credit scheme. This is basically a demonstration thinking, this is a farm, supplies to Fonterra, this is what Fonterra expects, this is what the scale of our farm is, how much data do we need to collect, how long does that take, and then we'll get all that information to make it clear to us and to others about practically how that might work on other people's farms. That's where we're at the moment. We literally took the samples last week, so watch this space.
There's there, and I'll just run you through what the main components are of the collar. So first, it sits on top of the cow's neck like this. On either side, the weight keeps it in the right position. We have 2 solar panels up the top, so there's no external battery, no swapping of batteries or anything like that. When a cow gets a shock, comes out the back here. You can see those strips. This audio cue to tell her when she's approaching a virtual fence comes out here. And it's actually bi-directional, so to get her to move that way, it'll play on this side, and vice versa, like that. As she's approaching, it's a beep, 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 beep. The closer she gets, the closer those beeps get together. And then when she crosses the line, it turns into a continuous tone. And the further over the line she gets, the louder it gets in pitch. So it's like, think of it as a truck reversing, and then you're about to hit the truck, beep, that one. So plenty of warning for the animal, and then you hit the car or get a shock. The collars also have a little LED light on here. This is actually a really neat little addition that I hadn't thought too much about until I saw it in action. You can either turn a collar on if you need to draft a cow out of the dairy, you want to see her coming in, this will just alert you to it. But it's also very handy at calving time when you have to check for black cows in the middle of the night in a paddock. So you can trigger it and you can see where she is. It also comes with the map. So each of these dots here is a cow. Can you click on one of them? You can click on any cow and comes up with who she is. This is her ruminating, grazing and resting behaviour, her predicted her calving date, 2023. Okay. It's a long gestation.
So this is demonstration done.
Yeah, sure. So this dark spot here, this is their today's allocation. The thick line, that's what their virtual fence. So they can't access this part up here. And same for these girls. You can see you can enable different kind of allocation. So this one's going on here just to make sure they get the gate and make sure the cows get the right amount. And when you are drawing a fence, it will tell you how much pasture you are allocating per kilogram of dry matter for those cows. So it enables a really precise allocation for those animals. So let's be these ones. They're electric fences. So these are we've got small paddocks because of the farmlets. So this one here is what Halter does when you get the collars. They drone map your whole farm. They mark in the laneways, they mark in the paddocks, they mark in water points and all of that sort of thing. So sometimes when you think about it, all these restrictions that we've had because of the need for physical fencing, how would you manage your animals if you could throw all that away? Because this allows it. One of the things I think about is we've put all this money, rightly so, into getting cows out of waterways and supporting infrastructure to do that. Very important thing. We do have to get cows out of waterways, but this tech could do it overnight.
Okay, what I'm going to talk about is more the experiences we had. We have a grazing management that is driven by a steering committee and farmers are part of it. We follow a fairly normal schedule of rotational grazing. We don't preference one or the other species. You just move the goalpost, you move the problem. If you focus on one, then the other one suffers, and the other way around. So we go in, the better farmers quite often here in Tasmania talk about 1,600 residuals, so that's probably where we sit at around that number. Go in at 3-1, so we still have 1,500 available per grazing and then just rotational graze. Our biggest challenge always has been, and you see that here already, clover is hammered down to, in these patches, to about, this clover is hammered down to about 2 centimeters or so, and the clumps of grass, they graze down to 8 or so. If you have clumps of grass, the stem seems to also elongate a little bit in the middle, so we can't get these to be nicely grazed out all the time. That has been a continuous challenge in what we have. What we also have is probably not necessarily the highest density of all our paddocks. You can see a little bit of dirt, but that is partly driven by the fact that we also had challenging conditions this year. If you go now to the next page, challenges with different species means, or having different species means different challenges. One of the things that we had in a couple of locations in our paddocks was that there was a little bit of clover die-off. There were some patches of clover disappearing. It turns out to be sclerotinia, which is a fungus that started growing. North America, or the Northern Hemisphere, calls it snow rot, coming out of a cold winter, not much ventilation, very damp. That's where it is visible a bit. If you go to the next...
You get that winter?
That was end of winter. So if you go to the next page, You see the fungus growing in the top picture and the bottom picture. Our board team had a good look at it and they grew it out a bit and they could see the spore forming part, and that confirmed it was indeed Sclerotinia. Only one paddock, these patches fill in again. One advantage of clover is that you can also call it an invasive weed. It fills in everything again. What we did see in other paddocks is a bit later is a little bit crown Sclerotinia, so that some of the clover leaf themselves started being attacked by it, but that was all minor amounts. Our bigger problem was the next page. We did have a wet spring, and in our case we only have 8 gates for all cows to go through. We don't have a choice. So we did have some bucking damage, and ryegrass, if it gets bucked, the tillers just move around a bit and keep on growing kind of. With clover you actually lose some of the plants, as you can see. Ultimately it fills in again, but it suffered a bit more, as you can see. If you go to the next page, but it did then mean that when it started growing it was maybe a little bit opener, and the bottom picture shows you what we sometimes have with the clover. When it is eaten out we still see a little bit of red dirt underneath. If you have very highly productive pastures, everything around the plantain grows so fast that there's too much shadings, and that ultimately causes the plantain to not survive in a normal way. We have high growth rates, so the rotation length is about 21 days or so. All right. We have 12 harvests a year, and there's 60 days no growth, at least 300. So spring and autumn are longer, but during summer, when you see these growth rates above break-even, we grow 75 per day. We go to 150 kilos regrowth. That's 20 days for you. It's not always there, so it's not the rotation length. It's the fastness of growth, how quickly it regrows. It gets shaded very quickly. Yeah. We had a lot of weeds. We had to splay the weeds out, and we lost all clover we had in at that point. So we had to re-establish clover. That caused a bit of a delay in when we could start. The clover was re-established successfully, as you see, and since then we have kind of retained what we had. Since then we wanted to re-establish, we saw the plantain disappearing and we were trying to get it back in, and these efforts have not made any difference. But at the establishment we had 20% or so. We have to go back to the numbers, but we started off with a high percentage of clover after initial establishment.
So in the past, this had been our runoff area before we built the new dairy. So it was pretty run down in terms of our nutrient levels. So back in April 21, we did a grid soil sampling program to come up with variable rates applications for lime, phosphorus and potassium. And then, so our lime, that averaged 7.6 tonnes to the hectare and varied from 700 kilos up to 10 tonne. Our phosphorus, on average, we applied 170 kilos, and that was anywhere from 0 to 220. And our potassium, that averaged 100 and was anywhere from 0 up to 250 kilos to the hectare. And then that was all incorporated down to 200 millimetres depth. So probably not such an issue on a fully irrigated site, but we didn't want to limit any of our deeper rooting species. If they want it to go down deeper, like acidity is a big problem here, so we didn't want it to rectify that. So yeah, that was to begin with, and then so we're doing soil sampling in the autumn, like every autumn, so we're about to do another one now. We do have a bit of a difference in the products that we've used. So farmlets 1, 2 and 3, they've been more conventional products. So we've used a product called Pasture King, which is basically a double super for our phosphorus and murate of potash for our potassium. Murate of potash, that's in the regen sort of area, that's probably the worst fertiliser you can use. So on farmlet 4 we've used sulphate of potash, and then we've used guano for our pea source. So even though we're using different products, we're still applying the same amount of each nutrient. So there's no difference in that regards. And then Farmlet 4 has also had a seaweed foliar soil conditioner applied to it, and that's got humates and amino acids in as well, which was recommended by some of our consultants that we've engaged with for our Farmlet 4.
So Farmlet 4 sits as a separate farmlet to Farmlets 1, 2 and 3, but there can still be a comparison between this system of input where we're putting 0 synthetic N in, so no urea at all, compared with 300 versus 150. So that's the way that the system's been set up going forward. So this one is a system where we're focusing on things like soil health, we're focusing on what might be a process that people who want to go down that pathway are using. So Farmlet 1 is 300 units of N, with a ryegrass clover mix. Farmlet 2 is exactly the same but 150. Farmlet 3 is exactly the same as Farmlet 2, but it's got a slightly increased species diversity, as Farmlet 2. So there's very clear comparison between Farmlet 1, 2 and 3. Farmlet 4 is 0 synthetic N, so 0 urea in the system, and mixed species, so about 8 different species, so complex species, managed more similar to a regenerative thinking. And so the consultants were brought in to enable us to go down that path. So, well, what we've tried to do in all of these is to maintain the level of nutrients so that they're not going to be limiting, except for the urea. Got a good diversity of species there, and they're very similar between our farmlets. So that's where we are, and we'll do a measurement back again in 2026 to have a look at whether that's changed. Some of the other measurements we've done, so total organic carbon, obviously, we've done that down to 60 centimetres, so we've done our cores right across our whole farmlets. And so here what you'll notice is for Farmlet 1, 2, 3 and 4, in the top 10 centimetres, 10 to 20, 20 to 30 and then 30 to 60 centimetres of depth. What you'll notice is that we've got about 6% total organic carbon in the top 10 and 20 centimetres, about 4% and about 2.5% down at depth. Soil moisture intake 14. So right here behind us is our probe. So the probe just sits out in the paddock somewhere here. And this here is a irrigation measured right up to last night. So this here is our pattern at 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 and 80 centimetres.